The Japanese generals couldn't believe what they were seeing. 3 years of planning, millions of soldiers prepared, and the Americans did something that should have been impossible. This is the moment everything changed. December 1941. Japan just pulled off one of the most devastating surprise attacks in history at Pearl Harbor. Their generals were celebrating. They crippled the U.S. Pacific Fleet, destroyed hundreds of aircraft, and killed thousands of American servicemen. The Japanese military command thought they had bought themselves at least 2 years before America could even think about fighting back. They were so confident that some generals were already planning victory parades in Tokyo. But they made one critical mistake. They had no idea what they had just woken up. Let's rewind for a second and understand what Japan was thinking. Their entire strategy was built on a simple calculation. Admiral Yamamoto himself said that Japan could run wild for 6 months to a year, but after that, he had no confidence in their success. The plan was straightforward. Hit the Americans hard, destroy their Pacific Fleet, capture strategic islands across the Pacific, fortify those positions, and force the United States into a negotiated peace before their industrial machine could fully mobilize. On paper, this made perfect sense. Japan had been preparing for war since the 1930s. Their military was battle-hardened from years of fighting in China. Their naval pilots were some of the best trained in the world, with thousands of hours of flight experience. Their Zero fighters outperformed anything the Americans had in the Pacific. They had aircraft carriers, battleships, and a warrior culture that emphasized death before dishonor. Meanwhile, America in 1941 was not ready for war. Not even close. The U.S. military ranked 17th in the world in terms of size. 17th. Right behind Romania. The army was using equipment from World War I. Soldiers were training with wooden rifles and trucks with signs that said "tank" because they didn't have actual tanks. The Pacific Fleet was smoking wreckage at the bottom of Pearl Harbor. American pilots were undertrained. American torpedoes were literally defective and wouldn't explode half the time. The Japanese generals looked at all this and thought they had plenty of time. General Tojo believed America was too soft, too divided, too focused on comfort to fight a long, brutal war across the Pacific. Japanese propaganda painted Americans as weak, obsessed with movies and jazz music, incapable of the discipline and sacrifice that war demanded. They thought American mothers would see casualties and demand their government bring the boys home. They thought the vast distances of the Pacific Ocean would work in their favor, stretching American supply lines to the breaking point while Japan operated close to their bases. But here's what they didn't understand. Here's what no one outside America really understood. The United States wasn't just another country. It was an industrial giant that had been sleeping. And Japan had just slapped it awake. Exploration/development. The first shock came faster than anyone expected. Remember how Japan thought they had bought 2 years? Try 6 months. June 1942. The Battle of Midway. Japanese Admiral Nagumo was leading a massive fleet to capture Midway Island and draw out what was left of the American carriers so Japan could finish them off. Japan had 4 fleet carriers, the pride of their navy. The Americans had 3 carriers, one of them so badly damaged at Coral Sea that the Navy estimated it would take 3 months to repair. American shipyard workers fixed it in 3 days. 3 days. The Japanese didn't even know it was back in action. What happened next shocked the entire Japanese command structure. American dive bombers caught the Japanese carriers at the worst possible moment, with their decks full of armed and fueled aircraft. In 5 minutes, 3 Japanese carriers were burning wrecks. A 4th would sink later that day. Japan lost 4 fleet carriers, hundreds of aircraft, and thousands of their best-trained pilots. The Americans lost 1 carrier. When the reports reached Tokyo, some of the generals refused to believe it. They thought it was a mistake, a miscommunication. 4 carriers gone. Impossible. But it was true. And this was just the beginning of their miscalculation. The second shock was the speed of American production. Japan's entire strategy depended on America taking years to build up their forces. Instead, American factories did something that seemed like science fiction. Liberty ships. The Americans needed cargo ships to supply their forces across the Pacific. Before the war, it took about 200 days to build a merchant ship. By 1943, American shipyards were launching a new Liberty ship every single day. Not starting construction. Launching. Complete. Ready to sail. One shipyard in California built a Liberty ship in 4 days and 15 hours just to prove they could do it. 4 days for an entire cargo ship. Japanese intelligence officers reviewing these numbers thought they were propaganda. No one could build ships that fast. But then they started seeing them. Dozens of them. Then hundreds. American supply convoys that should have been impossible were showing up at forward bases with food, ammunition, fuel, and equipment. The Japanese would sink American ships and more would appear like they were being spawned out of thin air. Aircraft production was even more insane. In 1941, Japan produced around 5,000 aircraft. Pretty impressive. The United States that same year produced about 19,000. Already more. But the Japanese figured, okay, that's their peak capacity. They're maxed out. Wrong. By 1944, American factories were producing over 90,000 aircraft per year. 90,000. That's almost 250 aircraft every single day. The Japanese couldn't shoot them down fast enough. One Japanese general, after seeing the intelligence reports, did the math and realized something terrifying. Even if Japanese pilots had a kill ratio of 10-1, even if every Japanese pilot shot down 10 American planes before being killed themselves, Japan would still lose because America would just build more planes faster than Japan could train new pilots. And it wasn't just quantity. The Americans were improving quality at the same time. The Zero fighter that dominated the skies in 1941 was outmatched by 1943. American Corsairs, Hellcats, and Mustangs were faster, more durable, and packed heavier firepower. Japanese pilots who survived the early battles talked about feeling like they were fighting a completely different enemy by the middle of the war. But the third shock was the most demoralizing. The island hopping campaign. Japan had fortified islands across the Pacific. Places like Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. They turned these islands into fortresses with underground tunnels, hidden artillery, overlapping fields of fire. They garrisoned them with troops who were ordered to fight to the death. The Japanese command believed these fortifications would bleed the Americans dry, that each island would take months to capture and cost tens of thousands of American lives. Some of that was true. The fighting was absolutely brutal. Iwo Jima was supposed to fall in 5 days and took over a month. The casualties were horrific on both sides. But here's what shocked the Japanese generals. The Americans kept coming. They didn't slow down. They didn't negotiate. They didn't ask for peace. They absorbed the casualties, learned from each battle, improved their tactics, and moved on to the next island. And the speed. The Americans would bypass heavily fortified islands, cut them off from supplies, and leave them to wither while the main force pushed forward. Japanese garrisons would be trapped on islands that were now irrelevant, unable to contribute to the war, slowly starving while American forces moved closer to Japan itself. Japanese commanders watching this unfold realized they had fundamentally misunderstood their enemy. Americans weren't soft. They were methodical. They were learning. And they had resources that seemed unlimited. One captured Japanese officer in 1944 was shown an American supply depot on a Pacific island. Rows and rows of supplies stretching as far as he could see. Ammunition, food, medicine, vehicles, equipment. Mountains of it. He said later that he knew in that moment Japan had lost. Not because of one battle or one defeat, but because he understood the scale of what they were fighting against. Japan was rationing rice. America was shipping ice cream to their troops on the front lines. Ice cream. They had refrigerated barges whose only job was to make ice cream for soldiers. The fourth shock was the Marines. Japanese forces had fought Chinese armies, British colonial troops, Dutch forces in Indonesia. They had won relatively easy victories. Their intelligence about American Marines was limited. They knew Americans had this branch called the Marine Corps but didn't really understand what they were. Guadalcanal changed that. August 1942. The Americans launched their first major offensive to capture an airfield Japan was building. Japanese command thought this would be easy. Send in some troops, push the Americans back into the ocean. Instead, The Marines dug in and held. Japanese reinforcements came. The Marines held. The Japanese Navy bombarded their positions. The Marines held. The Japanese Army launched night attacks, screaming charges, artillery barrages. The Marines held. The battle turned into a 6-month meat grinder. Both sides were exhausted, sick with malaria, low on supplies. But the Americans wouldn't leave. They adapted to jungle warfare, learned to counter Japanese tactics, and slowly pushed the Japanese back. When Japan finally evacuated their remaining troops in February 1943, their generals had to confront an uncomfortable truth. The Americans weren't just refusing to lose. They were getting better at fighting. Japanese soldiers started reporting something that terrified their commanders. They said American troops in the early battles were confused, disorganized, easy to ambush. But by 1943 and 1944, the Americans were learning faster than Japan could adapt. They were using combined arms tactics, coordinating infantry, armor, artillery, and air support in ways that overwhelmed Japanese defenses. They were using flamethrowers to clear bunkers, using tanks as mobile artillery, calling in naval gunfire with devastating accuracy. One Japanese after-action report from Peleliu described American tactics as overwhelming firepower followed by methodical advances. The report noted that trying to hold fixed positions against this approach was basically suicide. But Japanese doctrine and the samurai code demanded they hold positions to the death. So they died. In huge numbers. And the Americans kept advancing. But the moment that truly shattered Japanese confidence came with the invasion of the Philippines. October 1944. General MacArthur, who had been forced to evacuate the Philippines in 1942 after the Japanese invasion, came back. And he brought the entire U.S. Navy with him. The Battle of Leyte Gulf became the largest naval battle in history. Japan threw everything they had left into this fight. Their plan was complex, involving multiple fleets attacking from different directions to trap and destroy the American invasion force. If they could pull this off, they could cripple the U.S. Navy and maybe, just maybe, buy enough time to negotiate some kind of peace. It was a disaster. The Japanese lost 4 aircraft carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and 11 destroyers. The Americans lost 1 light carrier and 2 escort carriers. Japan's navy was effectively destroyed as a fighting force. After Leyte Gulf, Japan could no longer conduct major naval operations. They were done. But what really shocked Japanese commanders was what happened during the battle. At one point, a force of Japanese battleships and cruisers encountered a small group of American escort carriers and destroyers. These American ships were lightly armed and armored. The Japanese had massive battleships with huge guns. This should have been a massacre. And at first, it was going that way. The Japanese were closing in for the kill. Then the American destroyers did something insane. They charged. Small destroyers charging toward battleships. They launched torpedoes, made smoke screens, and basically threw themselves at the Japanese fleet to buy time for the carriers to escape. One American destroyer, the USS Johnston, got so close it was firing at a Japanese battleship from point-blank range. The Japanese sailors could see the American crew on deck. The Johnston was eventually sunk, but it and the other destroyers bought enough time. The Japanese commander, seeing this level of aggression from ships that were clearly outgunned, thought he was facing a much larger American force and ordered a retreat. When Vice Admiral Kurita pulled back his fleet despite being on the verge of a major victory, it broke something in the Japanese naval command. They had the Americans trapped. They had overwhelming firepower. And they retreated because they couldn't believe small American ships would be that aggressive unless there was a trap. The psychological impact of American forces refusing to act defeated, even when they clearly were outmatched, was something Japanese commanders couldn't process. After Leyte Gulf, Japan knew they had lost the war at sea. The only question was what would come next. And what came next was even worse. By early 1945, American B-29 bombers were flying from bases in the Mariana Islands and firebombing Japanese cities. Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe. The firebombing of Tokyo in March 1945 killed over 100,000 people in a single night. More than died in the atomic bombings later. Japanese air defenses were overwhelmed. They couldn't stop the bombers. American fighters were escorting the bombers all the way from bases that were supposed to be too far away for fighter escorts. Japanese generals watched American planes flying over their cities in broad daylight, and there was nothing they could do about it. The home islands were supposed to be impregnable. Japan still had millions of soldiers. They were training civilians with bamboo spears to resist an invasion. They had thousands of kamikaze aircraft ready to sacrifice themselves against American landing ships. The plan was to make an American invasion so costly that the U.S. would have to negotiate. But then came the final shock. August 6, 1945. A single American bomber dropped a single bomb on Hiroshima. The entire city was destroyed. 70,000 people dead instantly. Japanese scientists examined the reports and realized with horror that this was an atomic weapon, something they had theorized about but never came close to building. 3 days later, another atomic bomb hit Nagasaki. And the same day, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and invaded Manchuria with over 1 million troops, steamrolling through Japanese forces in days. Emperor Hirohito made the decision to surrender. For the first time in its history, Japan would be occupied by a foreign power. Many Japanese officers couldn't accept it. Some committed suicide rather than face the shame. Others planned a coup to prevent the surrender. But it was over. When Japanese generals finally met with American commanders after the surrender, some of them asked questions that had been haunting them. How did America build so much so fast? How did American forces absorb such heavy casualties and keep attacking? How did the U.S. Navy rebuild after Pearl Harbor? The answer was something they never fully understood. Japan had attacked a country that had the industrial capacity to outproduce the entire Axis combined. A country with a population that, once committed to war, wouldn't stop until total victory. A country that could lose 400,000 soldiers and still have the will to keep fighting. A country that turned car factories into tank factories, that turned housewives into welders building bombers, that invented entire new military technologies in the middle of the war. Japan's generals had studied American military readiness in 1941 and made plans based on that snapshot. What they didn't account for was what America could become when pushed. The sleeping giant didn't just wake up. It became something more powerful than Japan had imagined possible. The numbers tell the story. In 1941, the U.S. Navy had 7 aircraft carriers. By 1945, they had 99. In 1941, America had a smaller military than Romania. By 1945, they had over 12 million people in uniform. Japan started the war with a battle-hardened military and superior equipment. They ended it with cities in ruins, their navy at the bottom of the ocean, and American forces occupying their homeland. The Japanese generals who planned Pearl Harbor thought they were buying time. Instead, they started a countdown to their own defeat. And the speed of that defeat, the overwhelming force that America brought to bear, shocked everyone who witnessed it. Even allies like Britain and the Soviet Union looked at American production numbers and couldn't quite believe they were real. This is what happens when you underestimate your enemy. Japan saw America in 1941 and thought they saw weakness. They didn't see the factories. They didn't see the resources. They didn't see the determination. And by the time they realized their mistake, it was far too late to do anything about it. If you want to see more stories from World War II that changed history, check out the next video.